Well, good evening. My name is Pete Arkle and I'm CEO of New South Wales Farmers, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to our goat and sheep traceability webinar. I'm joining tonight from Camaragal country here in the north of Sydney, and I pay my respect to Indigenous leaders, past, present and emerging. And I also extend my thoughts and best wishes to our members across New South Wales that are facing some immense challenges at the moment, arising from this phenomenal weather pattern we're seeing and widespread floods. So certainly thoughts are with members and regional communities across New South Wales and southeastern Australia through this really challenging time. We're joined tonight on Zoom by Dougal Saunders, the Minister for Agriculture and Minister for Western New South Wales, and also Dougal Gordon, the Group Lead for Livestock Systems from DPI. Our chat function will be open on Zoom, but I would ask members and guests this evening to ensure respectful engagement over the Zoom chat. This is a topic that a lot of people have some passionate views on, and it's wonderful to be able to hear from the Minister and the Department this evening. So I'd now like to hand over to New South Wales Farmers President, Xavier to introduce the Minister.
Thank you, Pete, for that welcome and introduction, and to all attendees, welcome. I want to start by highlighting where we've come from in terms of the recent months in this matter. The New South Wales Government announced it would support a national EID system in response to the heightened risk of foot and mouth disease during our annual conference in July. Now, our annual conference delegates debated the issue at some length and decided to provide in-principle support for the development of a national individual traceability system for sheep, provided it meets 9 conditions. Those 9 conditions that they said the system must have jurisdictional harmonisation, reduce tag costs to an economically affordable level, in the example of a national tag tender, that it must financially assist farmers and the supply chain to invest in technology, be underpinned by an equitable funding arrangement across the supply chain, ensure NLIS database has proven capability, retain the option of tag-free pathways, a staged rollout over a 5-year period, be developed in consultation with producers, and lastly, that NLIS is the only system that is available for stock movements. Now, the issue of electronic tags has prompted a lot of conversations, and over the past couple of months, I've had the opportunity to speak with a number of members and non-members about this issue. In fact, it's been one of the main issues that many of you have contacted me about. We recognise that there are a lot of questions, and I hope that tonight we'll answer some of them, but there will be details that we need to continue to work through. I want everyone to know that we want to understand farmers' concerns. We have a seat at the state level. The needs of farmers are different throughout the state, but we must ensure no one gets left behind, to paraphrase a current Prime Minister. We acknowledge that this is especially critical for our Western Division and harvested rangeland goat farmers. Now, we're in the business in our association of getting the solutions right, not half a solution. So I think it's important to note that electronic tags are just one part of this national traceability reform. And I suspect getting every state and territory to agree to one set of rules will be like herding rangeland goats. But with those opening comments, I'll hand back to you, Pete, and you'll no doubt introduce the Minister.
Yeah, thank you, Xavier, and yeah, it is with great pleasure. I do welcome the Honourable Dougal Saunders, Minister for Agriculture and Minister for Western New South Wales, in the coalition government. So, Minister, I'd like to hand over to you to make some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Xavier, for your welcome tonight, and good to catch up with everyone on this Zoom meeting tonight. And just to, I guess, to start off with, to reflect what Xavier said, this is not about me or the Department of Primary Industries or anyone else saying what has to happen. What we've done is set up a starting point to start having those discussions with all groups through our reference group to make sure that, in fact, every single group is included. That's the point of having that start, which all started back in July at the Farmers Conference. So initially, we've started with $3.5 million worth of funding to give to DPI to actually start that preparation and planning. That's including the project team being set up, as in our EID implementation project team. That's due to be set up by the end of next month, and have a whole lot of different functions as to how it will interact with that reference group. Now, I should just point out the reference group. It's met a couple of times now. I joined on the first meeting just briefly to say good day and encourage everyone to be pretty open and honest. But we've got representatives from the New South Wales farmers themselves, a couple of representatives there, the Australian Livestock Markets Association, the Australian Livestock and Property Agents Association, Livestock Bulk and Rural Carriers Association, the Meat Industry Council, Integrity Systems, the police force are represented through the Rural Crime Prevention Team, and we've got sheep industry representatives as well. So there's a vast range of representation on that reference group. And we will fairly shortly be appointing a director in DPI to actually oversee the implementation of this overall program of sheep and goat electronic ID. Some of the things that have come up already at the reference group, and I'm sure people will have questions throughout the process tonight, but some of the things that have already come up are how to deal with things like goats, and whether there are different ways of doing it for managed goats as opposed to wild caught goats. And just to, I guess, reiterate that we're not saying the pathway is exactly the same for everyone, and there will be probably some steps along the way that reference group, again, has already started talking about. What does it start with and what does it end up with? That will be completely informed by industry, with industry at the table, talking about what you as producers want to see and are capable of doing at certain points in time. So the one thing that has come up, and there's probably been, maybe it's a lack of information, sometimes a bit of misinformation from some parts. The January 1, 2025 scenario is about making sure that we have a date to work towards where all lambs born on a property that year would need to be tagged. That's a starting point for something. If we don't have a starting point to aim at, then this will be like herding cats for the rest of our lives. So from my perspective, we've got the agreement in place now at a federal level with each of the other states around that. There has been a bit of an announcement from the federal government around some of its biosecurity measures, including some extra funding, depending on what states are doing. So again, I will be looking to make sure that we get as much benefit as is absolutely possible around our role to play in that, as we are sort of capable and seemingly leading on a lot of the biosecurity stuff. But we also have many lessons to be learned from the Victorian experience, and our team at DPI has been working very closely with the Victorian equivalent around what did or did not work and why, and how our pathway can be slightly better informed because we've already seen what has or hasn't worked for Victoria in the past. So, from a starting point, I think that has caused some consternation, and I absolutely get that. But there are different ways that things will be approached for different parts of the sector. And I'm hoping that will provide a bit more security or surety for particularly wild caught goat owners. There is a possibly easier way to get to what we're talking about than people maybe have originally thought. So happy to take on board the comments and questions that will come up tonight. Dougal Gordon, who's our livestock sort of manager for Department of Primary Industries, is on board as well. We've got other DPI people on the call who can step in if there are specific questions you need answered. But I guess from my perspective, at some point in time, all of the feedback I get is that if we don't have traceability at an individual level, at some point in the not too distant future, Australia's ability to be part of overseas markets will be diminished. And I certainly do not want to see that. But at the same time, talking about those 9 points that came up at the New South Wales Farmers Conference, I want to make sure that everyone is comfortable and capable of getting to where we want you to be able to get to in the timeframe that we are all working towards. So, Pete, I might leave it there and hand back to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Minister, and thanks again for joining us this evening. So I will now throw to Dougal Gordon, who is the Group Director for Livestock Systems at the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. And Dougal will be known to many of us here at New South Wales Farmers. So look, over to you, Dougal, for any additional builds on the Minister's comments.
Thanks very much, Pete. I've actually got a presentation, so I'll just share that if I may. Hopefully that's coming up on everyone's screen.
That is coming through. Thank you.
Great. So look, let me just start just providing some background context. Much of this is publicly known and available and hopefully shouldn't be too much of a surprise or profound to many on the call, but nonetheless, it's important to run through. So first and foremost, the SafeMeat 2020 traceability evaluation exercise, it concluded that only 70% of slaughtered sheep with visual tags in a mob-based system could be traced back to the vendor or property of residence for the previous 30 days. But in direct comparison, almost 100% of slaughtered sheep with electronic identification could be traced back to that vendor or property residence for over the same period. Big difference there, certainly cause for alarm, and it was certainly a catalyst for change in terms of EID. Obviously, everyone is very familiar with the foot and mouth disease outbreak in Indonesia earlier in the year. Again, very much a catalyst for change. Very concerning, of course, and this led to heightened awareness about certainly the impacts of foot and mouth disease and also in terms of preparedness activities in Australia and, of course, our response efforts in Indonesia as well. We also know that our export competitors have implemented electronic identification for sheep. Europe is one such example, of course, following the UK FMD outbreak in 2001. I'll talk a little bit about that some more as we go through. So why implement EID now? And I've probably touched on some of the reasons for that. Probably a first reason here is that the chance of having a significant animal disease incursion in Australia has heightened in the last few years. In fact, we think it's about a 56% chance of getting foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, African swine fever, avian influenza, or African horse sickness. And they're the most significant diseases from an Australian perspective. And that's what that particular figure relates to. You know, that's very concerning. We've certainly seen in DPI, we've been quite fortunate from a livestock perspective. The vast majority of incursions we've had in the last probably a decade have been predominantly plant related, but nonetheless we've seen more recently avian influenza, Japanese encephalitis, and of course on our border foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin. So it's just a matter of not a matter of if but when we'll likely get one of those 5 key diseases. As the Minister said, Victoria have already implemented electronic identification for sheep and goats from January 2017. And of course, diseases don't respect jurisdictional boundaries. We need a nationally consistent and harmonised traceability system, as Xavier said, and certainly that's the key goal. We're very fortunate to have that Victorian precedent. It means that we are able to have those learnings, as the Minister said, but also from a technical and operational perspective, a lot of the issues have already been addressed, and that's really important for New South Wales as the largest sheep and goat producing state. Cattle electronic identification has also been implemented, and there's a number of learnings out of that as well. The late 90s, and of course in New South Wales, it was mandated from July 2004. So really important from an FMD susceptible species perspective that we're starting to transition to more livestock species that are covered by EID. In terms of industry benefits, to me, I think these arguments are fairly clear cut. The key fundamental benefit of EID, it allows for more accurate and timely traceback. We know that in the UK, it took a month to actually detect that they actually had the disease in the country. It took a further 3 weeks to actually trace those individual animals. And as a result of that, their FMD outbreak was much larger than will certainly otherwise be the case. If we have EID, it allows a faster response time, it allows us to get back into our export markets and certainly reduce the impacts on farm gate prices. There's also a reputational benefit in that we're being able to manage disease and residues over time, and that's important for Australia's clean and green image. We also know that preparedness is much more cost effective than response and recovery, and that's why state and federal governments in Australia are spending so much time and money in Indonesia, because if we can actually prevent it coming to Australia, that will certainly reduce the significant cost burden right throughout the chain and more broadly as a result of something like an FMD outbreak. Australia is an export-orientated country. 66% of our sheep meat is exported, 95% of our goat meat is exported, 98% of our wool is exported. So given that export orientation, really incredibly important that we try and maintain that market access as best as possible. Everyone will have heard that $80 billion figure over 10 years. That's just a response cost. AMIC have suggested that it's actually, in terms of trade impacts, it's $300 million a week. Some of you who have read the media in more recent weeks will have seen the ABARES report, which basically said that in terms of foot and mouth disease, and only looking at our top 10 markets, the impact is actually $14 billion annually from a foot and mouth disease outbreak. So we're talking big numbers here. It's also really important to remember, and often at a farm gate level you lose sight of this, but those bans will impact everything from the live animals itself. So live export market will no longer be in place. It'll also impact, of course, animal products, and we're talking about, obviously meat, but also milk, hides. I've got pet food image there, and there's a whole range of other products, of course, that animals produce, and things like cosmetics, etc. So there's more broad scale impacts than the obvious ones we think of in terms of meat. And also, as we saw in the UK, led to a reduction in domestic consumption of meat. FMD is not a zoonotic disease, i.e. it doesn't affect both humans and animals, but nonetheless it led to a reduction in consumption of both meat and milk. And so that's of concern as well, if that was emulated as well in Australia, if we had an FMD outbreak. Now, the upshot of all of that is it's going to potentially lead to some significant farm gate price reductions. Now, in terms of on-farm, really important that we have this discussion. Producers are the major beneficiaries of getting back into markets earlier than would otherwise be the case post any sort of disease or residue ban. And so it's really important in terms of farm gate prices that we highlight that fact. Outside of it, EID provides the opportunity to deliver improved performance, monitoring and management, and that will lead to genetic gains, fertility, weight, and animal health improvements as well. So, of course, not everyone will want to do that, but having EID enables that at an individual animal level, and of course at a flock herd level as well. Now, of course, studs have already moved down that path because they've got to be the primary beneficiaries of having individual animal assessment and understanding and monitoring that that performance over time. But the top commercial producers have similarly transitioned as well, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about wool flocks, dual purpose enterprises, or meat flocks, where they're talking about sheep or goats. Obviously, the sheep side at this stage, given the proportion of goat producers who have managed, is a lot smaller. But on the sheep meat side, some potential large gains there. And there's, of course, a debate as to how involved producers really want to get with the technology as well, and that's part of the cost benefit that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, very much from the start, I want to point out this is a draft. This is the current draft that we've put before the reference group for further feedback. We've had a couple of iterations of this, and it's been great to have that joint approach between industry and government on this. But this is where we currently sit. It will likely change, but this is the current timeframes which we're working to. So we're looking to have an implementation plan drafted by the end of this calendar year in December and have that announced. That's in line with the announcement at an Ag Minister level. So the federated structure we have in place, and Dougal Saunders, our Minister for Agriculture, sits around that table, and that was the Ag Min approval in September, was to have an implementation plan up and basically announced and developed by the end of this calendar year, and have the 1st of Jan 2025 as the first day of a rollout of individual ID. So they're the timeframes which we're working to. Now, we're working around that, of course, in New South Wales, and this is what we've come up with. So 12 months after the implementation plan is announced, we're looking to have mandatory processor scanning. And then 18 months from that D-Day, then we're looking at mandatory sale yard, GoTepo, and property movement scanning. And then 2 years after, of course, the start date, we're then looking at, from a producer perspective, mandatory tagging of all sheep and farm goats. Important that I highlight the fact that we're not talking about harvested goats here, we're talking about farm goats. And important to point out that it's not mandatory tagging of all of those sheep and farm goats, only those ones at that particular juncture born on or after 1st of Jan 2025. And then 2 years after the announcement, we're talking about mandatory tagging for all movements of sheep and farm goats leaving the property. And then we've got a date there for 1st of Jan 2028 for bedding down. And what does bedding down mean? It means that we can actually look to try and resolve all those sort of potential teething issues, and monitor the current arrangements that we've got in place. So that's the draft timeframe which we're currently working to. In terms of next steps, that National Implementation Plan timeframe, as I mentioned before, so completion of that at a New South Wales and national level. We have representatives, just as industry does, at a national level on the Sheep and Goat Task Force. And there's also a co-design process as well, which both New South Wales Farmers has representatives along with New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. And so very much working hand in glove in terms of implementation at a national and state level. And we're also focused on communication engagement, really critically important. Tonight's webinar forms part of that. This process has already begun. For example, I've met with New South Wales farmers a couple of times now to talk about EID. It is an important issue, and we're looking to roll out a whole series of stakeholder engagement sessions as we go through the development of that implementation plan. Really keen to get that feedback, as the Minister said, from a whole range of different stakeholders. We do have representatives from the Western Division as well on that reference group, and I should highlight that fact. So we want to lock in those meetings with various those stakeholders, and that started to be done now. And we'll be looking to roll that out. We've appointed a consultant to help us go through that engagement process. We've got fortnightly sheep and goat traceability reference group meetings right through to Christmas. The Minister joined our first one. We've got the Director General of DPI also sitting around that table, along with all those various other groups that the Minister highlighted. So we've got every possible supply chain stakeholder in sheep and goats sitting around that table, and they've been really useful discussions. We're looking to do a study tour of Victorian sale yards and processes, their learnings, their sort of recommendations, what were the pitfalls, what were the, the things that we should avoid, what were the things that, we should look to do potentially differently in New South Wales. And we've been having a number of discussions with Victoria. We had them also at our most recent reference group meeting as well. And as the Minister highlighted right from the outset, this is very much a joint industry government process. We shouldn't at any stage want anyone to believe that this is a fait accompli, or that government is imposing anything in regard to this matter. So with that, I might just leave it there, and I'll stop sharing, and we can have some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dougal. It's a really detailed presentation. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that sets the scene nicely for some questions. So look, a lot of members have fed questions and thoughts through in advance of tonight. So I have a list of questions I'll work through that pick up on the key themes members have fed through in advance of tonight. However, if you do have other thoughts as we work through the webinar this evening, please do feed those through in the chat function, and we'll do our best to get to those. So I guess FMD's certainly been looming large, as has lumpy skin disease over the course of this year. I'm just interested, Minister, in your thoughts on how these reforms might assist in the event of that that potential for incursion in Australia that we all hope doesn't happen, but as Dougal suggested, maybe a 56% chance over the course of the next 5 years.
Yeah, and look, it's an important point. I mean, one of the things that we're taking very seriously is around preparedness, and preparedness includes everything you can possibly do. And that's based on, as Dougal said, it's the experience that we've had the advice from the UK. I've been lucky enough to have a couple of conversations with her, with DPI colleagues as well, around what it looks like to actually do preparation work. And that was the really one standout thing that we've been told: if you can get that right, everything else works far better than if you're on the back foot from day one. So as Dougal mentioned earlier, the UK detection didn't happen for quite some time. The traceability part of the equation is that the more quickly you can trace animals and individual animals, the better off you're able to actually trace it. Now, and I think James Jackson's made the point on the chat that the tagging is not going to stop the disease getting into Australia. No one's pretending that's what's going to happen, but it all forms part of an equation around biosecurity, and each part of that equation needs to be taken into account. And if it's not all taken into account and you've got some loose ends, then that's your weak point. We don't want to have any weak points. So the tagging is part of tidying up one of those weak points. The extra money that we found, an extra $65 million that we announced at the Biosecurity Conference in Dubbo, was around literally all of the other loose ends that we could think of after meeting with UK. And that's all around preparedness, running proper simulated events. We had a stop truck movement the other day near Molong as a training exercise. We need to be training the staff that are already interacting in many cases at sale yards or livestock carriers, those sort of people that are already part of this industry. We need to be helping train them and make sure that if something happens in the future, people actually know what that means and what that looks like. We need all of that preparedness work done. So the traceability part of it, it's not meant to be the only solution. It's part of a solution that gets us to a stage where we feel if it got into Australia, we're far more secure than if we weren't doing everything in the meantime.
Thank you, Minister. Xavier Martin, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. And look, whilst there's been a lot of questions, there's been one common one I've heard members and non-members ask me, and that is, how will this EID system facilitate the management of an FMD outbreak on my farm?
Well, look, again, it will be just part of the equation. So the traceability part will mean that we can, when I say we, the government and the departments can very quickly find the source of an outbreak and get to it as quickly as possible. Everything that modern day farmers are doing is becoming more and more digitised. It makes sense to be heading in that direction and digitising things, and that's just another part of that scenario. Now, it's not going to mean that you can't get FMD on your property. It's not going to mean that if you do get FMD, it's going to be fixed straight away because you've got tags. What it means is all of your livestock or livestock that has arrived at your place will be traceable virtually instantaneously, as opposed to trying to do a backtrack through a paper trail. So again, it's not meant to solve the problem of foot and mouth disease, but it's supposed to very quickly highlight where animals have been from and going to, so that they can be sorted out. Because one of the things is it's about trying to get back to FMD free status if FMD ever did get into the country. Part of that is around showing you've got full stringent traceability measures in place, and you can literally track every individual animal at that time, and then prove that FMD free status at a certain point in time as well. So again, it all fits into an overall piece of the puzzle to mean that we're trying to achieve the same thing, which is making sure we don't have it anymore. Did that answer that, Xavier?
Yeah, look, I think that needs, you've addressed the issue, Minister. I just think in listening to farmers asking me the question around how it facilitates the management of disease on their farm, that's the big gap. They really can't see where the advantage is for their individual farm. So it's certainly something.
Yeah, I guess individually though, it's it's about being part of, first of all, it's about being able to sell your animals for meat. If you're not part of the ongoing traceability system, then that's a gap that would cause you an issue as an individual farmer. And it's about protecting not just your farm, but all of the farms around you. So the traceability thing it's a joint effort. It's like anything. There does need to be a joint effort on this, because it isn't just individuals that will benefit. Every individual benefits by the team effort to make sure that every animal is traceable. But again, it's not about the management on your farm. I mean, it will change because you'll be able to trace all your wool stats or meat stats, birthing rates, all of that sort of stuff through one ear tag. So you get all of those benefits that stud producers are currently doing. And some would say, well, I don't want all of that. But in the future, there will be more and more demand for that. We know that the paddock to plate scenario has increased significantly. People want to know about the history of the animal, the wool they're buying or the meat they're eating. They want to know where it comes from, how it was treated, how it was raised. All those sort of things become part of that equation. And it may not happen tomorrow, but it's certainly more and more part of the story of how people are marketing their beef, lamb, pork, whatever it is. And that will form part of the story. But the traceability aspect of it is an overall traceability, because if there are weak chinks in that armour, that's what will let not just one landowner down, but the entire system down, and therefore the entire industry, and therefore large parts of New South Wales and Australia. So I think the individual benefit is that everyone is working on it together and everyone gets that benefit.
Thank you.
Minister, I'd sort of reflect on Australia's last major biosecurity incursion, that being COVID-19. And as far as national harmonisation goes, I don't think we did so well, and we've got a Royal Commission into exactly that now. What's your feeling around this question of national harmonisation, and what are you hearing around that admin table around, whether we can truly get to that national system?
Yeah, it's a good question, Peter. And I've just noticed that Rob's asked about LIS database as well. And part of that harmonisation is actually having a national system that every state can feed into meaningfully and have access to, and have that database working really well. Now, I think many people who use the current system would probably agree that it's a struggle at times. It can be clunky at times. People want to be able to pick up their mobile phone and see their data. I think that's important, having a database that works really well. And part of that will be about getting that agreement. Now, I'm happy to say I've worked pretty collaboratively so far with the Federal Minister, Murray Watt, and I'm hoping we'll continue to be looking for ways of partnering with all other states around the role of a state-by-state scenario, but also at that federal level. And one of the things that he and I have talked about is the federal government actually looking at revitalising, revamping and helping financially, back in that system going forward and make sure it is everything it needs to be, so that all of the states can feed in and there can be a seamless collaboration there. Now, that's at the high-end level. As you've pointed out, sometimes there are differences of opinion around the table as to how that should happen. And that, I'm sure, will continue to happen in some way, shape or form. But the idea that we actually have the agreement around moving forward on it is a really important one. And the other thing, I guess, that part of this will take is more financial injection from the federal government and all of the other states to catch up to where we are, or at least try and get to where we are to do their bit in the equation as well.
Thanks, Minister. Did you have any builds on that, Dougal Gordon?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. So just one comment in terms of the last question with respect to what does it mean on farm if we have an FMD outbreak, and what's the advantage of EID? And I'd probably go back to the first slide I had in place, which is that 70% figure that Safe Meat Traceability exercise determined. So under that particular scenario, there was 30% of animals after 30 days post-slaughter that they weren't able to identify. So that actually creates a whole heap of challenges for trying to respond to those emergency animal diseases, and that will in fact therefore influence a larger pool of producers, because we have to broaden that pool and those potential eradication zones until we actually are able to trace back securely. So that will affect more producers. and in fact, it will also lengthen the time of response. So that's the on-farm impact of EID and benefit of EID. You can actually reduce the amount of potential affected producers. The second question related to the analysed database. So absolutely, there is a view from MLA to try and improve the database. If you've looked at the federal government announcement overnight, there's 26 million allocated to improve the analysed database. MLA are looking to improve the functionality, the capacity, the user friendliness, the cyber security, the reporting ability of the analysed database. They'll do that as a mirror database, so it won't affect the operation of the current analysed database, so they can actually both work in tandem. So therefore you won't have impacts upon the current analysed database and its functionality whilst they're improving a secondary one. So just important to point out that yes, absolutely, they're looking to be improvements there, and the federal government has given the green light for that in terms of funding.
Well, just while you're there as well, there's been a few questions around the cost and who's bearing the cost around this. And I guess one of the other things that's come up in the reference group is around maybe how that can be shared. It's not just producers that are paying for it, but what discussions have you had around that?
Yeah, thanks, Minister. So we're certainly looking to do a cost-benefit analysis, and some early drafts have been done on that. But it's important to point out that those costs are significant for a number of different supply chain participants. For example, sale yards, they're going to have to wear a significant portion of the cost. If you look at Wagga, they'll need 13 or 14 auto drafters. Now, if you look at some of the other infrastructure requirements, so they'll need auto drafters, panel readers, they need software, they need hardware, they need Wi-Fi technology, they need to change their infrastructure. They'll have to modify their pens, and they'll have to modify their races. So they're looking at 50, 60K per auto reader plus auto drafter plus panel reader. That's alone, and then there could potentially be other significant costs. So processors, there's costs, of course, of putting in panel readers as well. So those costs are actually borne by a number of different supply chain participants. So we're looking at that at the moment. Really important, as part of the reference group, we've asked for all the reference group stakeholders, which of course represent that whole supply chain in terms of sheep and goats, to come back to us next Tuesday, which is in our next meeting, to put on the table what they see are the costs and the potential government assistance that they would require to actually help aid that implementation.
Minister, there's only 60 sleeps till Christmas and only 798 sleeps until the 1st of January 2025. Where did that figure come from? And obviously a fairly ambitious timeline. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, but I guess just to point out that the 1st of Jan 2025 isn't the end date, it's the start date of then providing, well, from I guess now or the end of this year, early 2023, the idea is to provide that 5-year time frame to get to 2028, but somewhere in that timeline, you need to have newborn on property of birth being tagged. So that was the midway point, basically, between 2023 and 2028. 2025 is definitely a reachable target, was the messaging that came back. And I think it does set in motion that there does need to be movement. So if you let things wander aimlessly for a period of time, then there's never any surety around this. So between 2023 and 2028, there's the 5-year time frame that people had talked about. But along that way, you need to have other timelines and set it out. So first of all, as Dougal had, the processes being from 2024, and then sale yards being from another 6 months down the track, and then place of birth from Jan 1, 2025, and then moving through that all the way through to 2028. And this is a draft, but if you don't set some of those draft guidelines, then time does just evaporate. So it was a time picked in the middle of, basically in the middle of where we were looking to get to. And that was fed in by industry. And from the reference group perspective, I don't think there's been any huge concerns, Dougal, around that. It's been a time when I think most people have been happy to work towards.
Well, just to comment on that, Minister, look, the timeframes, totally acknowledge from a reference group perspective that we need to probably have some clarity about potential government assistance, state and federal, as part of that discussion, because that has a bearing, obviously, then the ability to deliver against those timeframes. So certainly that's been, and it is an ongoing discussion as well until we get some of that clarity. But I think it certainly is achievable, as you say.
Yeah, and Pete, that's obviously one of the big questions that people do want to know, is that there will be some support there. Now, I can't say exactly what it's going to look like yet, but that's the point of the reference group, to really thrash out some of those concerns, see who bears what costs and how, federal level, state level, industry level, producer level, because it isn't going to be one group that's bearing all the cost. It does have to be a shared cost in some way, shape or form, including from the government. I absolutely fully acknowledge that. And the federal government does as well, and all of the other states. So it is a shared cost that we're going to have to look at, and the reference group, again, I think will come to some pretty clear guidelines or thoughts around how we need to get to that cost sharing arrangement, and then that's when we start looking at how we actually make it happen.
Certainly that theme of equitable cost sharing across the value chains coming through strongly from members. I'm just interested in sort of the future governance arrangements, sort of who will be sitting around the table, sale yard associations, AMIC. Yeah, are there any sort of thoughts around how we steer this into the medium term around governance around that?
Look, again, I think it's probably going to need to be driven by the people that are in the middle of it. Everyone who is part of it will have some sort of skin in the game, and that's important. And therefore, I think the governance, the driving forward of this will again be by that similar type of group that we've got currently working as a reference group. That really hasn't been decided, because we're very much in the early stages of all of this. But I think people that have involvement, both at an industry level and at a producer level, at a government level, will continue to have that input into the future. They're going to have that input into the future. But I think as much as possible, you want industry to be driving the success of what this scheme would look like, because it is industry that is really involved on a day-to-day basis. So, I mean, I would say that industry has to play a huge role in this, and that includes every landowner being part of industry.
Certainly there's a compelling case for intensive systems and breeders, and a lot of our members have chosen to adopt this technology for individual animal ID and all the benefits that flow from that. But when we look at the Western Division of New South Wales, very, very extensive pastoral systems, not a lot of interaction with animals. What's your feeling on that the case for Western Division producers, and how can we bring them with us on the journey you've outlined tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as Dougal said, there's definitely consultation happening with Western Division pastoralists. And, I really don't want anyone to feel like they're being left behind. That is certainly not what this is about. It's not about trying to say this is what has to happen and you're being told what to do. I've spoken to quite a few producers in the West, and everyone has a slightly different take on what they want to see and do. And as Dougal mentioned in his presentation, part of it's around farmed animals. And we recognise there is a difference between rangeland wild caught animals and farmed animals. More and more people are looking at increasing their productivity from, if we're talking about goats, for example, they're looking at getting better genetics into the mix and actually producing better bodies, therefore better meat, better weight, better payment, and similarly for sheep. So it's all about that management side of things, and that's why there will be time for that to happen. And I acknowledge that across the Western Division there are completely different systems set up in place, but from the perspective of actually getting to a point of traceability, at some point in time everyone does have to be on board. That's probably the more difficult end of that discussion. But it is one that is going to have time to be reached, and having a realistic voice on the reference group around what it means and what it looks like is important. And some of that for goat handling equipment, for example, will come at a cost. I'm talking to producers who are already investing in specific goat handling equipment anyway, because they want to improve their monitoring and their ability to tag their animals and that sort of thing. That's something that will become more and more part of the norm, but I don't want to, I don't want people to feel like they're being forced to do anything. But again, that will be probably part of the solutions that people are looking for, with encouragement and ability to get support. There's been a range of programs that the state government has supported people with fencing projects and troughing projects over the last decade. That's the sort of thing that I would see continuing as we continue to try and support all producers, including particularly those in the West who might be finding this a difficult sort of equation at the moment.
If I could just add to that, as we know, of course, the goat industry has increased in size over time. A lot of goat producers are also transitioning from harvesting goats to managing goats. So that's really important that that we actually acknowledge that. And of course, a lot of those producers are keen to improve the premiums they get for their product. And I think the prices that, of course, goat producers are receiving now, which is more than sheep, is a reflection of that change from more sort of harvesting opportunist style goat production to managed goats. The other thing that is important to point out for me is that, and one of the rationales that we've got for processor scanning early, is that ideally we want the marketplace to actually provide a potential premium for electronic identification for sheep and goats. Legislation is a blunt instrument. We'd much prefer for processors and other supply chain operators, whether they be consumers in terms of provenance or other supply chain elements, to actually drive the marketplace in terms of electronic identification.
Thanks, Dougal. Good question here from Terry Sim from Sheep Central. And I'm not sure if Terry's thought about a Goat Central, but I reckon that'd be a great publication. I'd subscribe. But look, will the federal budget investments in traceability go towards creating a national database that will correct some of the current cattle database problems, such as the shadow herd? So, any thoughts on that? I guess we've touched a little bit on that, but the federal budget, Minister?
Yeah, look, it's I haven't gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. There are some, I think, some opportunities there to work with the federal government on, more support for biosecurity in general. But there is, I think it was 26 million Dougal mentioned around the EID program and supporting states and the overall system above it. But we'll continue working on the best ways to roll support out. And look, there's been a lot of talk about how we can try and get cost of tags down, and whether that's a federal thing that we all help do some bidding on for tags that we get a bulk deal on, whether that's at a federal level and the states buy in, or how we work that out. So there'll be lots of interaction, I think, between the state and federal governments around how we can actually manage some of that. But I think it'll become more apparent in the next few days as to what the actual dollars and cents mean right now, and then how we can be looking to get more support into the future.
Certainly, this direct to slaughter theme does keep coming up, whether it's goats out west or sheep or lambs that go straight to slaughter. I mean, what's the feeling around tag-free options if you're looking at that sort of property of birth straight to slaughter scenario?
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of been brought up a bit in some of the presentation that Dougal had, but I might just bring Dougal in and talk about how people have talked about this in the reference group, because I think it's important that people are aware that it obviously has been discussed. Dougal, what sort of things have you heard at the reference group about this?
Thanks, Minister. It's an interesting discussion, Pete. Look, on the one hand, we have the agents and the sale yards who have said quite clearly, as part of the reference group, if in fact that you provide an exemption or tag-free movements for producers to go direct to slaughter, that would lead to some perverse outcomes. In particular, it would lead to the usurping of the sale yard system. And of course, as you can imagine, sale yards and agents are actively opposed to that. They're concerned that producers will be incentivised to go direct to slaughter, therefore, and completely remove that particular sale option. So that's what we hear from sale yards and agents. And of course, producers, there is, certainly among many producers, they are keen to have some sort of exemption for direct to slaughter, particularly whether we're talking sheep or even farm goats. And so there's differing opinions that sit around that reference group, and we've had numerous discussions surrounding it. There's pros and cons with all of this. We certainly haven't come to a landing spot either at a state or national level in terms of exemptions. So certainly happy to have the discussion. But as I said before, there's differing opinions on it.
Minister, sorry, I'm somewhat in the dark here in Lane Cove North, so forgive me for that.
Haven't paid your bills, mate, or what's going on there?
I'm trying something al fresco actually, but yeah, it's between the mayflies and the early sunset. I'm in the dark, I might say. But look, yeah, I mean, feral pest animals have certainly been top of mind for New South Wales farmers, particularly as the Parks and Wildlife Services helicopters are grounded this week. But we'll get on to that. But I mean, what's your feeling around the benefits of this reform for sort of feral pigs, for example? I mean, is that still a risk? Other government planning to tag all their cloven hoofed animals in all the national parks they've brought out west? How's the government thinking about this?
Yeah, I guess, well, I mean, first of all, just on the feral animal scenario, one of the bits of good news that we did get from the UK is that really in outbreaks, feral populations aren't really as highly at risk as many people suspect or think or believe would happen. So feral pigs, for example, or feral deer aren't really expected to be any sort of huge spreader of an outbreak of anything. I mean, there would be some possible interaction, but it's really domesticated animals that cause the problem. And we've seen that through the UK experience and other overseas experiences. So, not to say that we're not taking that seriously. And we're doing a massive amount of work right now with local land services around feral animals, and we've had some huge success with very well controlled and I guess mapped out landholder involved projects where you've got groups of landowners working together, doing baiting and also aerial shoots where we've seen just vast numbers of feral pigs particularly eradicated. And that's worked really, really well. We've got the FAST team, which is the largest aerial shooting team in the country. So we're really ramping up the feral animal control anyway. And it's not really because of the fear of a risk of spread of foot and mouth or something else, but it's good practice anyway. And look, the point around national parks is well made. It's a constant discussion that I have with other ministers around the responsibilities of public land being managed in the same way that private land is managed. And national parks have absolutely the legislative responsibility to do that, both pest and weed management. And, I expect that to happen at absolutely the highest level. So, we're always prepared to help out in that sphere, but it's obviously a budgetary responsibility of the Environment Minister to be looking after that. And we expect that to be done to the highest standard.
As do we, Minister. It seems the FAST team have had their wings clipped a bit in the last month, but we're working on that as New South Wales farmers. So, look, connectivity is a big issue, guys. I mean, I think our members have, seen declines in digital connectivity on farm across, major parts of the state. And Starlink was good for the first 2 weeks, but it's been a bit disappointing. So, what's your feeling around sort of whether connectivity could limit the transition towards the plan you've outlined this evening?
Look, I think connectivity is an issue anyway, and we'll keep punching on around trying to increase connectivity to all corners of New South Wales. But I don't see that it would be a barrier. I mean, for example, most of the databases or systems that would be used, even the current systems, you can store data that then downloads to the cloud or your server when you're in service. So it doesn't need to happen instantaneously right there at that point in time. So if you're in a paddock, by the time you get back to the house and maybe you've got internet there, or you can plug into your laptop and download there. It doesn't lose the data. So I think that the systems, the way they're built, are able to store and then download as soon as there is connectivity. But that's sort of only part of the solution. You're right. I mean, the connectivity issue we have is one that is being worked at a state level, although it is a federal responsibility. And we'll keep calling on the new federal government to interact and come up with different solutions. Starlink, I'm still hearing people are pretty happy with Starlink in my neck of the woods, but I guess as more and more people get onto Starlink, there'll be congestion issues. But I mean, I do think it's actually important to recognise that often private companies, i.e. Starlink, are far better equipped and more motivated financially because they can make good money out of having a good system and have the lack of, I suppose, need to fit around red tape requirements to actually get on and do things. And if I use the example of data hubs that were a big part of our plans locally, one of those was going to be based in Dubbo, a data hub to help speed up connectivity, but also provide a server for businesses to store data on so that it was always available really, really quickly. Well, a company called Leading Edge beat the government to that because they heard the government was looking at working on that. They did it far more quickly than government could really anyway, and they're now operating it with support from government. So often it's the incentivisation or the opportunity that government might provide or landowners, and we're working with a range of different providers around at a state level how we can increase connectivity with more fixed wireless, more of that Starlink type satellite operations, and also some of the paddock to paddock sort of scenarios that Field Solutions do, some of those more intimate solutions. If we can help that, happy days, always happy to do that. And sometimes us actively inviting private companies to do it increases their desire to do it. In the meantime, the federal government, we've seen a whole black spot program roll out, but I think the focus now needs to be on more data spots as opposed to black spots, because data is the thing that farmers are going to need more and more of into the future.
And if I could just add to that, from a producer perspective, the only connectivity requirements in terms of EID is if you actually do property-to-property movements, then you actually have to upload that data to the analysed database. Now, the vast majority of transactions actually relate to sale yards and, of course, processors. So in that instance, it's actually up to the sale yard or processor as the purchaser to upload the data to the database, not the producer. So there's actually not a huge connectivity challenge posed by EID unless you do property-to-property movements.
Yeah, thank you, Dougal. We've had a range of other really good questions to the chat room this evening. The path back if we do get an exotic animal disease outbreak, and sort of the time you might be talking, and what this means for small farmers. So look, we'll do our best to share some answers to those questions through the New South Wales Farmers Farm Post and our other channels. But look, I'd now like to, as the Minister said, this is very much early on in the discussion, and we've got some great representatives around that reference group table. So look, please do, as New South Wales Farmers members, or if you're not members and you want to join this discussion, feel free to join up as a member of New South Wales Farmers, and we've got some wonderful reps around that reference group table that are certainly advancing our members' concerns and interests in this very important discussion. So on that note, I'd like to pass back to Xavier Martin, New South Wales Farmers President, to close us out this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Peter Arkle. And look, I'd like to thank the Minister, Dougal Saunders, and the Group Director Livestock Systems, Dougal Gordon, for their attendance this evening and their presentations and response. I think it's very well regarded by our organisation, Minister, having free and open access to the interaction we enjoy with you and your department. It's very important. We'll continue to put forward the issues and the solutions as we see it. There's quite a few questions that Pete just referred to around the rationale for this reform still, and the timelines, and there's quite a few questions around costs, including those that are at the table and just how much skin they've got in the game, whether they're actually paying. And look, an extensive range of concerns, really, more than 20 that we're never going to get to tonight. So we're going to have to share those with you, Minister. And but look, on behalf of all those attending this evening, really appreciate this step along the way of engagement and progress. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Xavier. I might just finish off by saying, look, there's been a range already of farmer-based sessions with LLS and DPI attending all around the state. They will continue. I think we've seen over 2,000 landowners so far, and that's everything from broadacre to small farmers. So noting there were a couple of questions around small landowners. Please stay in touch. We'll be doing more of those. They're literally part of the preparedness stuff that we need to do, identifying disease and being able to know how to treat it. And as I say, this is a very much an open conversation. That reference group will keep people informed. We want people to be involved in this. Wayne has also popped up that he's a bit unnerved that I think feral animals are under control in the west of the state. I didn't say that. I don't think they're under control, Wayne. But what we're doing is trying to make sure we keep things under control as far as the spread of a foot and mouth disease outbreak. And the feral animals wouldn't be a huge contributor in it. But we will definitely keep on attack on the feral animal problem as well. But thank you for joining. I really appreciate all the work that the reference group is doing. Thanks for your activity, Xavier, as always, and Pete. And I'm always happy to jump on and have you when available.
Okay, good night.
Cheerio.
Thank you, Minister.
Everyone.
Thank you, Dougal Gordon. Really appreciate it, guys. Have an enjoyable evening, and we'll continue the
Not often you
discussion.
get two Dugals in the same room, is it?
Thanks, Xavier. Thanks,
Thanks.
Peter. Thanks,
See
Minister.
you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you, members.